The culmination of layers on layers of ruffles on ruffles, extravagant bows delicately placed on a lacy bodice, intricate hair pieces, and a skirt that resembles a beautifully decorated cupcake. It isn't rare to see this image while walking through the streets of Harajuku, Japan, a hub for all types of alternative fashion, where you're most likely to see Lolitas roaming the street. With multiple different substyles and dresses to choose from, Lolita fashion combines European, Victorian, and Rococo fashion trends with Japanese flair in order to create a modern-day princess. Alternatively, what might come to mind when thinking about Lolita is a young slim girl sporting the iconography of lollipops, stuffed animals, and schoolgirl outfits, looks seen on celebrities such as Madonna, Britney Spears, and Taylor Swift. This imagery was created by director Stanley Kubrick in his 1962 adaptation of Lolita and has since become vastly popularized and used in American audiovisual media. Nonetheless, the image of Lolita in Japan and Lolita in America create two vastly different images and effects on their respective popular culture. Lolita fashion rejects the idea of exposing skin and accentuated the natural body in order to preserve the sought-after innocence and beauty of the shoujo, a Japanese archetype of a young unmarried female who represents uncorrupted innocence and beauty. But how is it that both Japan and the West have created two completely different definitions of the term Lolita in the first place? How, if even, did Nabokov's Lolita evolve to create different representations of Lolita in both Western and Japanese culture? This piece will analyze how Nabokov's Lolita created a culture of infantilizing women through the popularization of coquette fashion in the West and the portrayal of the ideal woman in films and music, as well as discuss how Japan's pre-established infatuation with the shoujo archetype prevented Nabokov's Lolita from impacting their popular culture in the same way it did in America. In 1955, a tragic comedy novel by the name Lolita was written by the seasoned writer Vladimir Nabokov, quickly becoming one of his most iconic and most controversial works. The novel is narrated in first person by the protagonist of the novel, Humbert Humbert, recounting his affairs with Dolores, who's more commonly known as Lolita. Humbert Humbert was a 37-year-old who had run away with 12-year-old Lolita. They were constantly on the move in an attempt to hide their identities and their incestuous pedophilic relationship. Even one of the editors, Pascal Covici, believed that the publication would land them in prison. However, it is important to note throughout this video that the impact Kubrick's film adaptation had on American popular media far outweighs that of the novel in the ways each version chose to portray the pedophilic relationship between Humbert Humbert and Lolita. Lolita has a decent amount of adaptations made, and since its introduction to the West, Lolita boomed in popularity, amassing 2 film adaptations, a musical, multiple stage plays, an opera, ballets, and many more adaptations. The most popular of these, the film we'll be cross-referencing in this video, was Stanley Kubrick's 1962 Lolita film adaptation. And since, Kubrick's Lolita has become an icon with her heart-shaped sunglasses, primarily seen worn by many popular celebrities since, including Madonna and Taylor Swift. Before we delve into some of the research I've done, let's take a sneak peek at the Lolita culture in Japan. Lolita fashion is based on modesty, giving rise to covered shoulders, long sleeves, pairs of tights, and knee-high socks for accessories. The fashion is highly influenced by French Rococo and Victorian fashion trends, and has multiple subdivision aesthetics, ranging from hime, which means princess, to Gothic styles. The style broke into the mainstream through the success of visual kei bands in the 1990s, particularly Malice Mizer, whose guitarist Mana went on to create a Lolita clothing band, Moi Meme Moite. While it started off with handmade clothing made by fans of Malice Mizer, it opened the way for fashion brands to work with the style and create Lolita-style garments. It's important to remember that there is nothing sexual about the style and that it focuses on the innocence of childhood and elegance of dolls. In 2000, Social psychologist Serge Moscovici released a book explaining his social representation theory. As representations emerge in society through forms of communication, they eventually become a common sense view. And so, Moscovici explains that different cultures can develop different socially significant representations. In order for them to change, it must be in accordance with the culture's changing significances. So just as the West had its own interpretation of Nabokov's Lolita, Japan had its own as well. Margaret McLarty wrote Lolita is in the Eye of the Beholder with the intention of analyzing the perspective of pre-adolescent girls on Lolita to determine the effect that the Lolita archetype has on them. The journal entry draws from Irving Goffman's 1959 Framework for Dramaturgical Analysis of Social Behavior, which theorizes that the determinant of the gender script employed by these girls are usually peers their age, not adults. McLarty claims that by projecting presumptions about sexualization and objectification of adult women onto pre-adolescent girls, we remove the child's experience of discovering their idealized femininity. McLarty criticized M. Gigi Durham's The Lolita Effect because it projects the idea that the media is creating prostitutes or hypersexualized girls. McLarty responds that girls who experiment with hyperfeminine attire aren't attempting to attract the male gaze, and instead are experimenting with their self-representation. But one of the most important things that McLarty notes in her paper is that relevant research surrounding the Lolita effect and the negative effects of media sexualization often cite college-age women, who are likely to generalize younger populations. Unlike in much of the West, where adulthood is seen as a period of freedom, in Japan, adulthood is viewed by many young people as a gloomy period of heavy burdens. East Asian Studies major Teresa Younger wrote Japanese Lolita Dreaming, Despairing, Defying, which alongside Jessica Bieler's creation of the Lolita explores how the Lolita fashion was an indirect form of rebellion against key Japanese societal norms of self-discipline, responsibility, self-sacrifice, and hard work. In conditions where children are unable to express themselves both in and out of class due to societal expectations, it can begin to suffocate them. When they face so much pressure from their parents and fellow peers to succeed, it can have the opposite effect, and thus began the Lolita movement in the 1970s. As noted before, the Lolita movement was also a revolt against clothing that emphasized the female body. Following the 1800s, the Meiji era was the first to experience full interaction with the West after Japan opened up in 1853, and since has been drawing inspiration from Western clothing styles. Many Japanese women felt they had a hard time living up to the Western style standards of the mid-80s and found a welcome alternative in Lolita fashion. According to Bieler, both the style and mindset followed by these women was inspired by the Victorian era. Unlike their innocent and modest appearances, Victorian women were much different behind closed doors, and this is the lifestyle that many Lolitas wanted to emulate, upholding a youthful and modest facade despite what their inner personalities might truly be. Younger adds that the Lolita were also inspired by the Rococo era's obsession with detail and frivolity, but that in reality, Lolita didn't care about how authentic their looks were to either of these eras. The purpose of dressing in Lolita fashion was to create a world happier than the real one. Unlike the impact it had on American pop culture, Lolita had little to no impact on Japanese popular media due to an already similar archetype existing within its own culture, the shoujo. With the arrival of Nabokov's Lolita in Japan, the country's pre-established shoujo archetype left no space for a novel that depicted illicit relationships with a similar character to be accepted and adopted as a major component in their pop culture. Coquette fashion, often used interchangeably with the Lolita aesthetic in America, rose to popularity after Kubrick's Lolita adaptation. It encompassed hyperfemininity and included wearing lacy dresses, bows, Mary Janes, and hearts in order to be more girly. Usually those who dress in coquette fashion follow the similar hobbies, including reading, baking, and listening to Lana Del Rey. While it seems like a harmless subculture, it unintentionally encourages the infantilization of women and panders to pedophiles. Innocent, petiteness, and looking as childlike as possible are valued traits. An even bigger problem, many young women and girls who religiously follow coquette fashion tend to romanticize relationships with older men whose tradwife desires infringe on internalized misogyny. Lolita transcended her textual instance and became an archetype, an icon of youthful desirability. In the novel, Lolita is a tomboyish character with nothing conventionally beautiful. Humbert often notes when she picks her nose or adjusts her wedgie. The reader is constantly reminded that Humbert's desire and lust for Lolita is monstrous throughout Nabokov's novel. The glamorized and refashioned Lolita displayed that agents of American popular media was ways away from the young girl that sobbed every night when Humbert feigned sleep and turned the manipulated 12-year-old into a vamp. Just like the coquette girls who have been molded by the media to infantilize themselves through fashion and body weight for the attention of older men, it could be argued that other young girls are doing the same, subconsciously caused by the distorted portrayal of the ideal body in American media. While adult women serve as role models to these younger girls, they shouldn't be blamed for dressing and behaving the way they'd like. Instead, many factors such as the child's family dynamic might have more of an impact in their behavior. But the purpose of this video isn't to villainize women who prefer a youthful or childlike look, nor criticize young girls experimenting with more revealing clothing, but instead to begin to offer insight on why prepubescent female bodies are so often sexualized in the media. Unfortunately, pedophilic ideals have been buried within our society. Women, as a result, continue to face various challenges in winning the approval of what society expects of them. In a patriarchal society, women are constantly pressured to fit within a mold created by males. This has even affected young girls who are exposed to various messages that our media contains. With that, I hope girls do not continue to be sexualized or feel like the only way to be validated is by fitting the male gaze.